What if the reason you keep checking your phone is not lack of discipline, but learning, not conscious learning? Not the kind that happens in a classroom, a deeper kind. The kind your brain is doing all the time, quietly in the background, without asking permission. You tap the screen, you get a message. You feel a small reward, and somehow, without deciding to, you become a little more likely to do it again. So the question is not just why rewards feel good. The real question is why rewards change behavior. This is one of the central ideas in psychology. And once you see it clearly, you start noticing it everywhere, not just in phones, in habits, in motivation, in procrastination, in parenting, in school, in addiction, in almost every repeated behavior a person has. This idea is called operant conditioning. But before we define it too formally, it helps to look at the pattern. A behavior happens first, then a consequence follows, and that consequence changes the chance that the behavior will happen again. That is the core structure: behavior, consequence, future behavior. If the consequence makes the behavior more likely, psychologists call that reinforcement. If the consequence makes the behavior less likely, they call that punishment. So already we know something important. Behavior is not only shaped by intentions, it is also shaped by outcomes. That sounds simple, maybe even obvious. Of course, people repeat things that work, but that still leaves a deeper question open. Why does the system work that way at all? Why would a consequence have the power to reshape future behavior? To answer that, we have to go back to one of the most famous ideas in behavioral psychology. B.F. Skinner studied how behavior changes when consequences are attached to it. In his experiments, animals were placed in controlled environments where certain actions produced certain results. Press a lever, get food. Perform a behavior, receive a consequence. Over time, the animal became more likely to repeat the behavior that led to the reward, not because it understood a rule in words, but because the system learned from the result. That is the first big reveal. Rewards shape behavior because they act like signals. They tell the organism, in effect, this action mattered. Do more of this. And the more consistently that signal appears, the more the behavior starts to strengthen. This is what reinforcement really is, not just a reward. A behavioral strengthening signal. That is why the technical definition matters. Reinforcement does not mean something pleasant in a vague sense. It means a consequence that increases the likelihood of a behavior happening again. That increase is the key part. This is also where many people get confused, especially with the words positive and negative. In everyday speech, positive sounds good and negative sounds bad. But in operant conditioning, those words mean something much simpler. Positive means something is added. Negative means something is removed, that is all. So if you study for a test and then get praise, that is positive reinforcement. Something desirable was added, and the behavior becomes more likely. If you put on your seatbelt and the annoying alarm stops, that is negative reinforcement. Something unpleasant was removed, and the behavior becomes more likely, different route. Same result, the behavior increases. That point matters because it reveals the hidden rule. Rewards shape behavior not because the brain is chasing pleasure in some cartoonish way. Rewards shape behavior because the system is constantly updating what actions are worth repeating. The brain is not just reacting, it is learning. And this is where the topic gets more interesting. Because what counts as a reward is often broader than people think. Food can be a reward, praise can be a reward. Relief can be a reward, certainty can be a reward. Even the removal of discomfort can function like a reward if it strengthens behavior. That means behavior is being shaped not only by pleasure, but by whatever teaches the system this worked. Now we can go one layer deeper. Why does the brain care so much about what worked? Because learning systems are built to detect useful patterns. If a behavior leads to something beneficial, the system stores that information. If it does not, the behavior weakens. In neuroscience terms, reward-related learning is closely tied to prediction and reinforcement signals. The brain is constantly tracking outcomes and adjusting future behavior based on them. This is why rewards are so powerful. They do not just end an experience, they update the next one. They influence what you will want, notice, expect, and repeat. A reward today is also a training signal for tomorrow. And once that process repeats enough times, a deeper pattern begins to appear. Rewards do not just shape isolated actions, they build loops. You do something, you get an outcome. The outcome strengthens the pathway. Then the next time the situation appears, the behavior comes faster, with less effort, with less conscious thought. This is the bridge between operant conditioning and habits. At first, the behavior may be deliberate. Later, it starts to feel automatic. That shift is one of the most important things to understand. Because many people think repeated behavior is mainly a character issue. They think I keep doing this because I am lazy, or weak, or undisciplined. But operant conditioning suggests a more accurate explanation. Very often, repeated behavior is repeated because it has been reinforced. That is a major mental shift. Most people assume behavior is driven mostly by willpower. But a better model is that behavior is often driven by reinforcement history. In other words, your past consequences help shape your present actions. This explains a lot of real life. Why do people keep checking social media? Because every check carries the possibility of a reward, a message, a like, something new. And even if the reward does not come every time, the uncertainty can make the behavior even stronger. That is called intermittent reinforcement. And it is one of the most powerful schedules in learning. If a reward appears every single time, behavior can grow quickly. But if a reward appears unpredictably, behavior can become extremely persistent. That is one reason slot machines are so powerful. And it is one reason digital platforms are so sticky. The next reward might come now or now or now. And the possibility itself keeps the behavior alive. This also explains why some good habits are harder to build. Exercise is a good example. The behavior is beneficial, but the reward is often delayed. You do not always get an immediate signal that says, yes, repeat this. So the reinforcement is weaker in the short term, even if the long-term outcome is excellent. Meanwhile, checking your phone produces a fast, easy, immediate possibility of reward, so the short-term learning signal is often much stronger. Now we can answer the original mystery more clearly. Why do rewards shape behavior? Because rewards function as learning signals that increase the future probability of whatever behavior produced them. And because the brain keeps updating itself based on those signals, that is the mechanism. Not magic. Not motivation slogans learning. Once you understand that, behavior starts to look different. You stop asking only, what am I doing? And you start asking, what is reinforcing this? What consequence is teaching this behavior to continue? That question is often far more useful. It can change how you think about procrastination. Maybe the task is stressful, and avoidance creates relief. That relief reinforces avoidance. It can change how you think about habits. Maybe the habit is not irrational at all. Maybe it is highly reinforced. It can even change how you think about other people. What looks like stubborn behavior may actually be learned behavior that has been strengthened over time. And that brings us to the transformation moment. Most people think rewards are just nice extras added after behavior. But the more accurate view is that rewards are teaching tools. They are not decorations attached to action. They are part of the mechanism that builds action. That means if you want to understand behavior, you have to understand reinforcement. Not just whether a reward exists, but how quickly it appears, how often it appears, what feeling it creates, and whether it makes the behavior easier to repeat next time. Because once a behavior is reinforced enough, something important begins to happen. The system no longer needs as much conscious effort. The pattern starts to run on its own, and that raises the next question. If rewards can shape behavior in the beginning, how do those behaviors eventually become automatic? How does reinforcement become habit? And why do some habits keep running even when the reward is no longer very satisfying? That is where this gets even more interesting, because operant conditioning helps explain why a behavior starts. But the next layer explains how that behavior becomes part of your everyday wiring. That is what we will explore in the next video.